All right, for this tutorial or demonstration, I'm going to do a simple landscape. So to start off here, you notice that I have my paper taped down. Mine's to the table. You could have it taped down to the table or to a board, but I want to make sure that it's not warping while I'm painting. You could use any of these colors. You could use kind of that simple one, this one with a few more options, or the tubes of paint. And I'm using a pretty limited color palette. So to try to keep it simple, I got a Payne's gray, a sap green, uh, a light blue there, and a yellow ochre. And if you don't have those exact colors, that's fine. I got two different brushes. I got a wider flat brush, and then I'm using that water pen brush kind of thing with the water in the end of it. And then I have a cup of water, paper towel, and then this white pencil I'm going to use for resist. To start off, I'm gonna have a foreground where I want some type of flowers or something going on. So I'm just making some white dots, some white lines, clumping them together. You want to make sure that you're avoiding the polka dots. So I'm kind of clustering them and strategically placing them to appear random. You don't need to overdo it. Just a handful will be enough there, and I'll come back and I'll finish that at the very end. I'm gonna start with my sky, and I'm gonna use a wet on wet technique. If you recall from the techniques that we went through on the 12 technique worksheet, and so I'm laying down some pools of water, and then I'm gonna grab Payne's gray or some combination of dark blues. I'm gonna kind of make like a cloudy overcast type sky. And so I'm going to use that tube there, and you see some junk comes out. It just hasn't been used in a while, and that's all right. I won't touch that junk. I'll pull just from the pigment there, and you can see it's a really dark blue. So I grab a little bit of a lighter blue and bring that over to it. But it's going to be diluted down, and it's going to be really really unsaturated or desaturated, which means that it's not going to be a very strong kind of color because I just want it to be kind of cloudy and gray. I drop the pigment into the water that I have placed on the paper, and it kind of diffuses, and it's a really organic way to get kind of like an uneven, cloudy type of sky. And I'm going to use a kind of a combination of three techniques here. I'm using wet on wet to get the pigment down. I'm making a little bit of a gradient, so it's a little bit darker at the top, and then I'm also doing a lift technique to make a little bit of clouds too, or some uneven patches of color to make it look like there might be some clouds. And here I'm just reworking it a little bit to get the light and dark areas where I want them to. And I probably could have went a little bit darker at the top there to make it the blue a bit more visible than what it is, but whatever, it's all right. I'm gonna start the next thing I'm gonna do is with the background. So I mixed in some green and some Payne's gray, and I put it on the paper there, and you see it runs all over the place. And I don't want to do that because I want a crisp line for my horizon line. So I'm going to drop down and do the tree line actually right now. And so I'm going to have it a little bit more of a brighter green, a little bit more saturated. And this is a little too saturated because things that are far away from you are desaturating. So I'm gonna keep adding a little bit more water and a little bit more Payne's gray, and I'm using that desaturation to show perspective, basically. So I'm leaving a space between the where there's water from the sky, and I'm dropping down just a little bit, and I'm working on the tree line that's going to be like in the very background, or the second for the second farthest back layer. And I'm being very organic with my marks here, uneven. I want to make sure that I'm avoiding having like a really straight tree line because trees are different heights, they're different thicknesses, they're different. Some are farther away, some are closer to me, and I can show that by having darker and brighter greens, different lengths going different directions. And so as I want to get some darker areas, so I'll grab a little bit more pigment and not use quite so much water so that it's a little bit more saturated. So there I'm kind of doing the trees that are in front of that, or giving a little bit of definition to that tree line. So I finished that tree line. It's kind of the patchy saturation. I did a little bit of the ground in front of that tree line with some yellow ochre, and now I'm doing the very back, the farthest background layer. And like I said, I wanted that crisp line there, and so I needed to let the sky dry a little bit. And now I just used some Payne's gray, and I'm filling that in, and that's kind of like the very distance behind the tree line even. Now I'm gonna keep working on this middle ground in front of the tree line. So I'm just mixing together yellow ochre, Payne's gray, and that green, and it's gradually getting a little bit more saturated as it gets closer to the foreground. And I'm being uneven. I'm trying to show some hills, or maybe like a meadow or something in between there, and the different saturation levels will kind of show the hills, or show a rolling plain type of thing, or and maybe some grass type of texture as the different colors diffuse into the water. Because I'm working wet on wet, even though there's not a ton of water. I'm mixing colors that are wet, and they're not necessarily drying as I'm continuing. And as I'm working my way to the foreground, you see that some of those white dots that I made earlier are now showing through, and I'm just going to paint over those. I'll see where the dots are, and then I will work back on top of it with a much more saturated green to kind of do the very foreground foliage of the flowers or wildflowers or whatever is in my foreground there. And so I mixed up a little bit of a little bit more saturated green. I'm just doing some grass, and it's wet on wet, so it's diffusing, and it's a really soft kind of effect. If I wanted it to be more crisp, I would have to let it dry a little bit, like I did for that skyline. So to summarize, the further back in the image, the more water I'm using, and as I work my way to the foreground, the less water I'm using, the more pigment and the more saturated the colors become, and that will help create the illusion of space in the image. And the last thing I'm going to do is go back with a really saturated pop of color to help accentuate, or to add some emphasis to those white dots that I made, and make it look like some flowers in the foreground. So I'm using red, and I'm working wet on wet, so you can see the red kind of diffuses a little bit. And if you wanted those crisper lines, you would need to let it dry a little more, which is what I do after I lay these dots down. They kind of they soften out, and then I'll make some more once it's dry to get some of those crisper edges. And you can choose whatever color you wanted here, as long as it's saturated. Really is the biggest thing. And so there's the picture of the final image after I removed the tape, and you got that nice white border around it. So a couple things to keep in mind here is you need you need a background, middle ground, and a foreground. And as you work closer and closer to the foreground, you want to have your color get more and more saturated, and that will really help you create the illusion of depth in this painting, which is our learning target, or our main objective. So go ahead and work through this. Follow kind of the framework for creating depth. You don't necessarily need to match the colors or match any details in particular. We're really just aiming to create that atmospheric perspective by using different saturation levels.